Greetings, and thanks for joining us once again for another bi-weekly update. My name is Carlos Salinas, and I'm the Regional Director for the U.S. Soybean Export Council of the Americas. A pleasure to have you with us. This presentation is assigned for key customers like you. It is not openly shared with everybody, and it is also designed for USEC's internal purposes. We hope that you find the information valuable, and please continue to send us your feedback so we can improve this presentation. Before we get started, and as we always do, we like to recognize USEC's membership. Within that wide and diverse membership, we have soybean processors, soybean exporters, seed companies, equipment manufacturers, railroads, surveyors, brokers, traders, among many other important stakeholders and funding sources. And we cannot forget the support and contribution that we receive from the U.S. soybean farmer. Without that support, this presentation would not be possible. We have a slightly more extensive agenda today. We're going to talk about prices. We'll talk about weather. We'll do a follow-up to soybean meal export pace. I think it's important given what has happened recently, even though we addressed this 2 weeks ago. And 2 weeks ago, we also talked about soybean meal quality. We specifically focus on protein. This time, we're going to take a look at digestibility of how much of that protein is really available for the animal, which we believe is more important than protein itself. So let's talk about prices. The chart I'm about to share with you, I think it will be familiar to you because I've done this before. I'm showing you different commodities with the prices normalized at 100% as of January 1 of 2023. And we're going to take a look at that percentage evolution over 2023 and year to date. So let's take a look at some of those commodities and some of those numbers. In this particular case, you can see that hard red winter wheat and rice have dropped about slightly over 5% over this time window. When we take a look at corn, corn has dropped over 8% since the beginning of the year. Soybeans have dropped about 10% since the beginning of the year. When we take a look at soybean meal over the same time window, soybean meal has dropped over 11%. I would define this as a significant drop in price for soybean meal. And when we talk about soft wheat, soybean oil, and palm oil, those commodities have dropped over 20% during this time window. I would say a significant drop. I would just make a note that in the last few days, we've seen an uptick on prices. You can see that by this little clip here on the very end. Something that we need to be aware of because there's something driving that. To put things in context, I have added 3 commodities to this chart, and that is first sugar. Sugar is up 39% year to date. When we take a look at cocoa, that's up 17% year to date, and coffee is up 8% year to date. So the reason I bring them to the table is because I just want to contrast commodities that have struggled with unfavorable weather conditions and what the impact can be. We're not immune for those changes going forward, and we have to be aware of the risks that are in front of us. So many have asked me if this drop of in price of soybean meal over 11% is a significant drop or not. And the reason I say we had a significant drop is because if you take a look at that price evolution over the past 20 years, 11% is probably the largest drop that we have over this time window. And to validate that, I'm going to show you a chart that normalizes the price of soybeans for the July contract as of January 1 at 100%. But instead of comparing different commodities, we're going to compare to different years. Over the past 20 years, we're going to see exactly what has happened to the price of soybean meal, that is. So the next chart is going to be very similar, but it's going to have 20 different lines. Each line represents a different year. And you're going to see a very thick red line, and that line is for 2023 for the July contract. So you'll find this chart interesting. You can see that over the past 20 years, we have had soybean meal rally as much as 54% over this time window, 28%, 21%, 15%, and we've had certainly drops in prices. But the drop that we have this year of 11% is unique, 11.4%, as it is the biggest drop in prices that we've had during this time window. So again, something to keep in mind as you consider your purchase decisions and other variables and indicators that you need to look at. Keep in mind that over the past 20 years, we haven't seen a drop as big for soybean meal as we have seen in 2023, at least in percentage terms. So let's move on and let's talk about weather. What I want to do on the weather is I want to show you the U.S. drought monitor, but I want to compare the U.S. drought monitor in 2022, how we looked exactly a year ago and how we look today. And because I think there is some, it's very good to contrast the situation. And I think it's very important for you to be aware of this. Not that there is a tremendous risk on the crop today. I think it's quite early to be concerned. But as we look at the current drought conditions, I think we need to keep a close eye. So on the very left, you have the U.S. drought monitor for 2022. And if you remember last year, we had a significant drought in the West, Nevada, Arizona, California. It was, I would say, quite a disaster as we got to Texas. And I think some of those plains really struggled with the drought conditions. When we got to the soybean area, corn area, we were impacted for sure in South Dakota. We were impacted in parts of Nebraska, but keep in mind that Nebraska has a lot of irrigation in their production. So people that had irrigation actually did okay. When you take a look at Kansas, Western Kansas was heavily impacted, but not a lot of soybeans grow in Western Kansas. So I think overall, I would say that the soybean production area at this time, even though we were concerned of that drought expanding, it held very well because it didn't expand that much. Now, when we compare this chart and we go to the right, where we take a look at the U.S. drought monitor for May 30th, 2023, where we stand today, we have certainly we don't have the drought that we had in the West. Obviously, we had a lot of precipitation, which alleviated some of those stress areas. But then again, not many soybeans grow here. We do have drought certainly in Nebraska. We do have a drought in Kansas. And certainly what concerns me a little bit is compared to the map on the left, that we have abnormally dry conditions expanding certainly in Missouri and Iowa, parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, that we didn't have last year at this time, right? So not that there is a major threat, but I think we have to be aware of that abnormally dry conditions that is evolving in those states, because those states combined are basically our core production states. And if we're seeing abnormally dry conditions and that persists, it would be certainly a reason for concern. And the markets would obviously price that risk accordingly. So when we take a look at the 6 to 10 day precipitation map, I think we got overall normal conditions. Maybe we're leaning slightly below average precip in Iowa, northern Illinois, but really nothing to be concerned. Maybe Minnesota is seeing a little bit of a drought, but not overly stressful at this stage. So let's move to our next subject matter. This is something we discussed 2 weeks ago. What I'm about to share with you may sound repetitive, but I think it's important, and you need to be aware as you take a look. When we take a look at soybean meal export sales as published by the USDA, this report has a benefit of giving us a good read on the current marketing year and the next marketing year. The data that we have for this particular presentation is as of the week ending May 25th. This report actually came out last Friday. So it's, I would say, the latest information that we have. And this report compares outstanding sales and accumulated exports for this week, and it compares that information to a year ago this week, right? So we can do some year-over-year comparisons, which is important to us. So the calculation that I explained to you 2 weeks ago, and I'm repeating it today, we're going to take a look at this week's outstanding export sales, and we're going to add that to this week's accumulated exports. And we're going to compare that to outstanding sales a year ago, including the accumulated exports of a year ago, and we're going to compare those two numbers. So once again, to give an example, when we go to the European Union, we take a look at this week at outstanding sales, 206,000, which you have over here, accumulated exports of 550,000 for a total number of 756,000. When we compare that to a year ago, we were at 64,000 metric tons of outstanding sales, accumulated exports of 205,000. So we were at 269,000 metric tons. So with regards to the EU has improved its commitments for U.S. soybean meal by 181% compared to last year, a significant uptick. When we did this calculation 2 weeks ago, the EU was only 143%. And we have to keep in mind that the EU imports about 18 million metric tons of soybean meal, or they represent 27% of overall soybean meal imports. So if the EU, as a major importer, is beginning to shift to the US, you need to be aware, because it's likely going to significantly change the availability of supply, physical supply from the US, because there's a finite number. The US only exports at most 13 million metric tons of soybean meal. So the EU is a big player. When we take a look at Asia, Southeast Asia primarily, we do a similar type of calculation, where this week the sum of those two numbers is at 2.8, almost 2.9 million metric tons versus 2.5% last year. We can say that Southeast Asia, this region, is up 16%. When we did the calculation 2 weeks ago, we were only up 7%. Again, this region continued to step up. Between Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Thailand alone, they import about 17 million metric tons of soybean meal. Certainly, you know, the U.S. is a small provider compared to South America, but this region is, again, aggressively coming to the U.S. So if this region begins to wake up and decides to move to the U.S., they will certainly take out our capacity relatively fast. So again, between the EU and Southeast Asia, we have to keep our eyes open, because it could have a significant impact to the supply availability of the U.S. And my concern is mainly for the Western Hemisphere, in this particular case, Latin America, and maybe Canada to a certain extent. But when we take a look at Latin America, right, this week, the outstanding sales and accumulated exports add up to 6.4 million metric tons. We were at 7.1, almost 7.2 million metric tons a year ago. So we are down 11%. And when we take a look at 2 weeks ago, when we talked about this, we were also down 11%. We've improved our purchases, but we're still down 11% to a year ago. So we are not making any headway. And I know that when I meet with our customers in the region, you know, we talk about the increases in consumption. We talk about the increases in different feed rations. So we know demand is picking up. So I'm a bit surprised why this region is actually behind. And we have to be very careful, because, again, the EU and Southeast Asia, they are sleeping giants for U.S. soybean meal. They wake up, and they can certainly have an impact in the market. So let's move to our next subject, soybean meal quality. We talked about protein 2 weeks ago. Now we want to talk about digestibility. And I want to talk about KOH, which is potassium hydroxide solubility analysis, which involves assessing the proportion of protein in soybean meal that can be dissolved in a percentage of potassium hydroxide solution. This measure is percentage, and for many serves as an indicator, one of many, because there's many indicators for digestibility of soybean meal that have to be used in combination. But this indicator gives us an idea of the potential protein digestibility. Generally, proteins that are more soluble in KOH are more likely to be digestible when consumed by animals. So again, this is one of many indicators. You cannot use it solely. You have to use it and be accompanied by other indicators, we're more than happy to put you in contact with the nutritionists and our experts to help you in that process. But I want to share with you some of the results that we've seen for our data provider, Evonik, regarding the median KOH that we've seen recently in the month of April, coming out of all the origins. In this particular case, we see Argentina, that typically had 76.9, 74, 73, 75%. Median KOH dropped to 71.80. So quite a significant impact on the digestibility of that soybean meal. And again, we have to keep in mind that Argentina is the largest soybean meal exporter in the world. And certainly they've had a lot of challenges with their crop this year, which could explain some of these problems. When we take a look at Bolivia, again, Bolivia competes with other origins, mainly within South America and Peru, Chile, and Ecuador. But we've seen a slight reduction of that saleability in the month of April. Nothing meaningful, just a slight reduction. When we take a look at Brazil, Brazil actually has seen an improvement to February and March, which is good. Slight drop from January, but 77.15. And when we look at the U.S., we can say the U.S. has been kind of boring, maybe consistent around 78%, 78.4. Not much of a change, typically very uniform. And we can say that 4 out of the 7 months that we looked at, the U.S. is probably the only one exceeding 78% the ability and these results. Now, one of the factors that we like to take a look at, and we've done it before for protein, is we like to see how how uniform this data samples are, which I think it's very important. And for that, we use a standard deviation, right? So when we take a look at Argentina, and I think for obvious reasons, the standard deviation in Argentina is picked up to 6.67, obviously quite significant. I was surprised with Bolivia. Bolivia actually has a very low standard deviation for KOH at 2.47. And we take a look at Brazil. Brazil is actually reduced a little bit, that standard deviation. And once again, the U.S. remains very consistent, very similar to last month, 3.54, very uniform. And again, it's one of those things, I think for U.S. soybean meal, you kind of know what you're getting because it's typically very consistent from that perspective. So, but really, what does the standard deviation really mean? How could a formulator take a look at it, or what safety margins should be taken when you take a look at this? Now, I think it's important to consider that when you take a look at a median KOH of 71.8, in this particular case, Argentina, and you take a look at a standard deviation of 6.67, one standard deviation safety margin takes that value to 65.13, which is quite low for soybean meal digestibility. We take a look at Bolivian soybean meal, 76.80 with 2.47 standard deviation. That takes you to 74.33, a significant improvement clearly to Argentina. Brazil, you take a median KOH of 77.15 and 3.72 standard deviation, then one standard deviation safety margin takes you to 73.43. At this particular case, Bolivia would lead the way with 74.33 on the lower range of that safety margin for standard deviation and KOH. The U.S., obviously, with 78.40 and 3.54 standard deviation, stands a very good footing, I would say, leading the pack with 74.86 on the range. Obviously, a good amount of the samples, one standard deviation range, I think 68% of the data would fall between 74.86 and 81.94. Not that bad, I would say, pretty good. So again, I hope the information shared here was valuable. I apologize for taking slightly more time. I thought it was important to go over these few items, and I look forward to speaking to you in a couple of weeks, and I hope to hear from you soon. Have a great week.